Communist Party who've always had a strong place in Glasgow. I'm coming from a much more radical position that's been, up until very recently, poorly documented in Glasgow, and that's anarchism. And there's a lot of preconceptions and particular misconceptions about what anarchism is and the anarchist history of Glasgow. So it's going to be a wee bit unique in that respect. Some of this is only came to my knowledge in the last couple of years, and I was really quite blown away by some of it. There's a couple of people here who've got much better knowledge on certain things that I'm going to cover, so they might want to add a wee bit. I would say at any point in this walk, this isn't me, right, stop here, listen to me, move on, and I'll talk again. It's an interactive thing. We're all here for the same thing, and it's please, if you've got anything to contribute, no matter how small you think it is, please do so. So this is the first protocol. Glasgow Green, the importance of Glasgow Green cannot be underestimated. But before I talk about the Green, I'm going to give you one caveat, and that caveat is a lot of these places that we're going to be looking at no longer exist in the form they did when we are talking about them in a historical context. Also as well, just to clarify things, I'm going to give you a definition of the word anarchism, and it's the word anarchism as given to the Encyclopaedia Britannica in 1910. So this isn't just some sort of fly-by-night definition in some fly-by-night publication. This is an austere and redeemed publication. And there will be a lot of wee anomalies here as we go. This definition was actually submitted by an anarchist. And just to confuse things even further, this anarchist was also a prince, a genuine Russian prince, and also he renounced his title very early on as well, didn't he? So Kropotkin's definition of anarchism is the name given to a principle or theory of life and conduct under which society is conceived without government. Harmony in such a society is achieved not by submission to law or obedience to any authority, but by free agreements concluded between the various groups, territorial and professional, freely constituted for the sake of production and consumption, as also for the satisfaction of the infinite needs and aspirations of a civilised being. I think anybody would be pretty hard-pressed to disagree with that. That seems like a fair way to lead your life in my books. But anyway, I want to start with something that happened just outside the Green. This will be my starting point. And for me, this is what I would regard as proto-trade unionism. On the other side of the Green, we had what was once the village of the Calton. And in 1787, we had the Industrial Revolution really just starting to kick into gear. And what had happened was the weavers, who up until then were amongst the elite of the working class, earning good money, dictating their own terms, found their position being eroded by mechanisation, and basically them going from being high earners to poverty-stricken pretty quickly. So in 1787, the Calton weavers started to agitate for a wage increase. The dispute grew bitter. They decided to take guerrilla tactics, destroying the looms, getting into warehouses, setting them on fire, etc. And they made bonfires and put the contents of the warehouses on them. So on the 3rd of September, the city magistrates, with a force of officers, went to the Calton, but were driven back by a mob of Caltonians. A detachment of the 39th Regiment marched, and a pitched battle occurred at Park House in Duke Street. The Riot Act was read, and a volley of musket fire killed 3 of the weavers and injured others. Further disturbances were quickly suppressed by the troops. This was the earliest major industrial dispute in Scotland, the Calton weavers becoming the first martyrs to workers' cause in Scotland. And every year there's a commemoration down in the cemetery in Abercrombie Street where the monument actually is for them. Right, but going on to the Green proper itself, right, it was established in the 15th century when King James II granted the parkland to Bishop William Turnbull and the people of Glasgow. And this is where it starts to get interesting for me. The Green's first troublemakers. Football, a medieval game played on the Green, was outlawed in 1457 by the orders of the King, with fines to be issued against players of the, and I quote, ungovernable game. Now that is the interesting two words for me, ungovernable game. The forces of law and order do not like anything that they cannot control. Always has been the case, always will be the case. So, yeah, in 1792, other land in the city is sold off by the town council, and the money raised is used to purchase the Green for the princely sum of £7,543, so that the people of Glasgow, and again an interesting quote, were secured as an open space for all time to come. Now, that doesn't ring too true to me. I was here a number of years ago with my friend and her two wee daughters at the time, and I took her to one of the play parks over there, and we were stopped by security guards. No, you can't come in. Transmit, we're setting up for transmit. And one of the excuses no doubt will be used is that it raises money for the good of Glasgow. Throughout the 80s and 90s, there's a bit of the Green down over there called Flesher's Haw. And Flesher's Haw, the council at various times tried to sell it off. And it's now used, it's been fully developed, it's got playing fields on it, and I don't know under what arrangement that was done, so I'm not going to make any assertions as to how that came about. But we lost part of the Green a while back, and then, as I said, we've now got all these events that you can't get into on the Green. This Green, which is basically owned by the people of Glasgow. Right, so post-Napoleonic War, so that'd be 1815, the town council hired 324 jobless workers to remodel the Green. Further improvements were made in 1817 and 1826, right? So again, same problem, and this is something we'll see time and time again through it. That's, you have a war. The only beneficiaries of war are big business. And when a war is on, it's a boom. It's an absolute boom time for big business. The armaments industry, able to build things and sell them under government contract usually. At the moment, we're seeing the same thing at the moment with weapons going to the Ukraine. In fact, something that I never realised until recently, and it was quite naive of me, a lot of weapons have a shelf life. And at the moment, they're waxing lyrical in the West about how good it is. They've got a load of 80s tanks and they're sending them to the Ukraine at the moment. And they're almost presenting this as if it's some sort of virtuous act they're doing. The Ukrainian army will appreciate and understand the 80s technology. If we gave them something more modern, it'd be a wee bit beyond them. So yeah, draw for that what you want. And also, shells have a shelf life. So yeah, this is great. This is getting rid of your stuff, for want of a better word. It's getting a bit stale. So yeah. The Industrial Revolution. 1765, James Watt comes up with the idea of the separate condenser boiler, increasing the pace of the Industrial Revolution. The Central Belt starts to emerge as Scotland's industrial epicentre, and I believe some of the ideas were actually come up with while he was walking across the Green, right? Now, in one respect, yeah, it took us into the modern age, but it was an absolutely seismic shift. We went from being an agrarian country into an industrialised country with all the growth pains that goes with that. The rise of the middle class, the rise of the very, 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 very wealthy people, and of course we're in a situation where we've got stuff like the Jacobite War, the last Jacobite War ending no long before that, with a situation where the people that were involved in the Jacobite uprising in 1746, the ones that weren't killed at the time by the Duke of Cumberland because they went on a deliberate hunt down of everybody they could get and slaughtered them, absolutely slaughtered them. But a lot of them were sent as a lot of the people that had fought at the battle and supported the Jacobite cause ended up getting put to places like Jamaica to work as slaves, basically, on the plantations. Although it wasn't billed as slavery, they were told they were going there for 15 years and then they could come back after 15 years. And I would imagine if some of them lasted 5 years, they were probably doing really, really well. So, yeah. As I say, I'm going to draw parallels as I go here. You may disagree with me. You're more than welcome to say, I disagree. This is my take on it. Right. So, moving forward a wee bit further, insurrection, suffrage and independence. The interesting thing for me is independence comes up time and time and time again. Are we all familiar with the Darian expedition? Yeah. Some people know. Yeah, everybody knows.
Was that South America?
Yes, it was. It was 3 missions where boats were sent out to the Isthmus of Darien, idea to create what they called an entrepot, an area where they could sort of control world trade movement, and basically all 3 expeditions were failures. Amongst other things, they took goods out to the natives that were living there, and now these were like Native Americans. So one of the expeditions, they filled the ship with periwigs and Bibles for them to take them out, thinking that, yeah, they'll really want these once they see them. And basically what happened was the first expedition out, nobody heard anything from it. Oh, it must be doing well. So they sent the second expedition out. Second expedition's nearly there, and word filters back to Scotland that things have not went well with the first expedition. So essentially, the rich elite in Scotland are bankrupted, and they're constantly being courted by the English government down in Westminster. Come on, enter into this union with us, and eventually the Treaty of Union was signed in 1707, and it seems that at the time when the Scottish nobles were going down the Royal Mile to sign it off at the Scotland end, they were getting booed by the Edinburgh mob and stuff thrown at them at the time. So even at the Treaty of Union, the idea of the United Kingdom was one that was met very, very, very hostilely in certain quarters. And the nobles in Scotland, a lot of them were given English land and, more importantly, English titles. They went from being rough Gaelic speakers to having land in England with an English lord's title to go with it, and their sons were sent away and educated at English schools, so they themselves grew up to become lords. So we had that situation, and there was a huge financial settlement for them as well, and they were very, very, very aggrieved when they get this financial settlement, because they got it in something they'd never ever seen before, paper money. They were expected to be paid in gold coinage, which of course didn't happen. Yep.
It's a microbank, 1% population, like the wealthy is 1%. And it's interesting to know, but obviously, as I said, Adam Smith was right in Wealth Nations. And so when he was talking about being opposed to the state intervention in the economy, he had in his mind like a parliament being elected by the top to 5% of the population, the wealthiest people. So basically, his arguments in favour of low state intervention is basically don't let rich people interfere in the economy because they're going to do it for themselves. So a bit of social context in terms of Adam Smith there, because he was quite class conscious, he was well aware, but who was making the decisions. And if you read, so that's part of the context. So in terms of you've got a treaty being passed by a parliament elected by less than 5% of the population, the wealthiest 5%, and apparently that's to bind people of Scotland and England and Wales for eternity. And there's absolutely no democratic mandate for it at all. So just to put that in, just
No, that's good. That puts a bit of flesh in the bones. Thanks, Ian. So, yeah, in 1816 on the Green, 40,000 people gathered for a meeting to demand more representative government. Interestingly, representative government. What Ian was alluding to there. And a repeal of the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws existed to keep the price of grain artificially high, and it had a knock-on effect for bread, which was a staple food of working class people. In 1820, with the Radical War, strikers carried out military drill on the Green, and of course it's illegal to form your own private army. This was followed by a week of strikes and unrest across Scotland, seeking radical demands and reforms. A committee for forming a provisional government placed placards around the streets of Glasgow late on Saturday the 1st of April, calling for an immediate national strike. On Monday the 3rd, work stopped in a wide area of central Scotland. This led to a number of disorderly actions which were broken up by the militia. Notice I'm saying the militia here. Don't have an organised police force as such, so it's the military that are being sent in. Militia taking prisoners to Greenock Jail were attacked by local people and the prisoners freed. This is where it starts to get really interesting. Sorry, there is a wee bit of detail here on the Green. There is less on the other areas. So it's heavy at the beginning and it gets lighter as we go on. Right, James Wilson, a freethinker and a religious sceptic. Again, another very interesting and radical position to hold in 1820. Led a band of radicals from Straven to march on Glasgow. They were told that there was French troops at Cathkin Braes ready to support them. Right, yeah. Despite no French support, they marched towards Glasgow under a banner declaring, very interestingly, Scotland free or desert. What's that? 113 years after the Treaty of Union? As pertinent then as it is now. They found no mass insurrection and returned home. Wilson was arrested and charged with high treason. He's hung and beheaded. And I think there was a possibility that he was actually hung here. Yeah. And historically, just wanted to make aware of a couple more things. There's Crown Street over there. In Crown Street in the mid-1870s, there was a French communard living there. I could have made a joke about Jimmy Somerville there, but I won't, right? Just too lame and too obvious. But yeah, the communards were the people that were involved in what was called the Paris Commune. Were basically on the 18th of March to the 28th of May 1871. A load of revolutionaries got together, basically seized Paris and ran it along more egalitarian lines. They immediately closed all the Roman Catholic churches and schools, and then socialist, feminist, communist and anarchist ideas were used to basically run the city. So one of these communards in exile was in Crown Street. The background to May Day, which is always is regarded as Workers' Day and a lot of the time is associated with Russia, actually, as we know it, started in Chicago. The catalyst for May Day, the 1886 Haymarket Massacre in Chicago. A bombing took place at a peaceful demonstration. People were wanting the 8-hour day. The logic being you get 24 hours a day, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for any of the other activities we indulge in as human beings. 8 anarchists spoke at it and were arrested. 2 were accused and committed to life imprisonment. 1 committed suicide in prison. 4 were hanged. 1 being Albert Parsons. His wife, Lucy Parsons, 1851 to 1942, went on to become an internationally famous anarchist speaker who spoke in Scotland. And the interesting thing for me is I've got a photograph here of Lucy Parsons and an illustration by an American artist, Walter Crane, commemorating the Haymarket martyrs. But the first thing you'll notice about Lucy Parsons is she's what they would now term a woman of colour. Albert Parsons was Caucasian. America had miscegenation laws banning in a hell of a lot of states one race to marry into another. So some of those states held miscegenation laws up until the late 60s, 1960s that is. So that's quite interesting. So instead of keeping Lucy Parsons quiet, the execution of her husband actually radicalised her further. And she travelled extensively, and she always had a sympathetic audience here. And here's a picture of May Day on the Green in 1913. Right, so, yeah. Okay, so, right. First May Day on the Green was 1891. In 1917, which is a Tuesday, 100,000 people were here for May Day. May Day 1918, thousands of May Day strikes in Glasgow. First World War still on the go, yet there's all these strikes. Moving forward to the general strike, which took place in the first week of May. Over there, Ruby Street in Dalmarnock, there was a tram depot. It's now just a wee dead-end house in street. Miners marched on Ruby Street, tram depot, but they were actually ambushed and beaten up by police at the entrance to the tram depot. In 1937, at the height of the Spanish Civil War, 15,000 people marched under a banner, solidarity with Spain, right? And I've got a photograph of that as well here. Where is it? It is here somewhere. Yep. Right, this is, nope, that's not it. The other one. Aye. This is the 1937 photograph. I want to just talk briefly about other anarchist women that visited Scotland and Glasgow. Valterine de Clare, a prolific writer and opponent of capitalism. She was born in 1866 and lived to 1912. She was against marriage, the state, the dominance of religion over sexuality in women's lives. First visited the UK in 1897. She was known to have developed a close political and personal relationship with an anarchist couple in Carfin Street, about 2 miles up the road in Govan Hill. Those people were called Maggie and Will Duff, and quite a few letters for Valterine de Clare to the Duffs survive. And it was evident not only were they politically close, but on a personal level, they obviously had a very, very, very deep and warm relationship. And the correspondence goes on to at least the 1930s between them. In fact, they actually published one of her books of poems, The Gods and the Peoples. And she was asked about what she felt about Scotland. And she said if she could make a living there, she would never return to America. The next woman I want to mention is Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was a Russian anarchist that lived a lot of her life in America. But she came to Britain, and did she come to Glasgow, Ian? Yeah. I couldn't quite find that out.
Quite a few times.
Yep. Quite a few times, good. Yeah. So she had a marriage of convenience to a Welsh miner who was actually born in Govan in 1925. But this might seem a bit abstract, but it actually ties into what we're talking about here. In 1892, she helped her lover, not her husband, her lover. She didn't believe in marriage. And this is quite common even in the mid-19th century with anarchists. They have relationships with each other, but they don't marry at a time when that was the expected thing to do. In fact, in anarchism, there is a kind of recognised form of marriage, and it's basically just your friends and associates recognise you as a couple, and that's called a free union. So anyway, she was involved in an assassination attempt with her boyfriend, Alexander Berkman, who wanted to assassinate an American industrialist called Henry Clay Frick. Thank you. And quite interesting, right? The attempt was unsuccessful. Yes, no, I'm going to say why, don't you worry about that. It's no killing people for killing people's sake by any manner of means, right? There was the Homestead Strike of 1892, an industrial lockout and strike devised by the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers against the Carnegie Steel Company. Andrew Carnegie was born in Dunfermline. Poor Scott went over there to the States, made an absolute fortune, and they made it on the misery of working class people. When there was strikes, any form of industrial insurrection, he would get strike breakers in. Strike breakers would be very heavy-handed, not averse to killing people, and a lot of the strike breakers were supplied by a man from the Gorbals, Alan Pinkerton, of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. So there you have it. So Andrew Carnegie had placed Frick in charge of the steel plant, and he'd placed him in charge because Frick had actually said that he was going to break the union. And what actually happened was the strike breakers were actually overpowered by the union members, and they won the battle. But the American government immediately set in the National Guard, and the National Guard gave the people on strike an absolute tanking. But taking just that a wee bit further, I don't want you to think of Berkman as just some loose nutter that tried to just kill somebody rich. He did have some thought process behind what he done. So, which brings me on to the main man himself, Andrew Carnegie. He gave away $350 million in the last 18 years of his life. In Glasgow, you'll see that in the forum of the Carnegie Libraries. Most of the Edwardian libraries in Glasgow are Carnegie Libraries. As far as I'm concerned, he was trying to salve his conscience. In 1899, he was a member of the he was a member of the Southfork Fishing and Hunting Club, which was above a place called Jonestown. And what had actually happened was 60 miles further up there was a dam, and the dam had been poorly repaired over the years. And when the Hunting and Fishing Club was formed, they'd just done a series of patch repairs to it. And there'd been a particularly bad winter that year, a lot of snowfall. It took the level of the dam up considerably higher, and the dam eventually gave way on the 31st of May of 1889, and 20 million tonnes of water come down on the town and killed 2,209 people. So that's the kind of way that the rich industrialists in America were treating ordinary working people, just with utter contempt, and Berkman couldn't stomach this. The members of the Hunting and Fishing Club very quickly and very astutely telegraphed each other, made them aware of the disaster, and they formed the Pittsburgh Relief Committee to assist victims, and that way they actually managed to skillfully dodge paying out anybody that had lost their lives in it. And just to put it further in context, there was another famous American industrialist, a guy called Jay Gould, 1836 to 92, and he is actually quoted as saying, "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half." It really was that clear that the industrialists in America really had nothing but contempt for the people that worked for them. So I'm sorry, that was quite heavy, a lot of wordage there. It's going to get a bit lighter from now on in, okay? So what we're going to do is we're just going to head over there and we're going to go up into Turnbull Street there, and we're going to just go up for about 50 yards or so and stop, okay?
I think it's not a bad area back in the day, quite kind of, well, certain bits here, like kind of rich, influential people.
Yes, yeah. But the industries that sprung up in the east, where, I mean, Denniston in particular was developed for the middle class in the 1850s. Right, aye. Yeah. Yeah. But when the factories came, the way the winds blew, they suddenly thought, oh, this stinks, and they all headed further west. Yep. And then, of course, one of the big railway companies bunged Glasgow Uni to ditch their, then what would it be, 450-year-old university, and say, we'll build you a brand new spanking place up in Garnet Hill. So that's how they ended up there. But as I say, we'll just head up here into Turnbull Street, and I'll... This is, in my opinion, one of the most important historic locations of the late 20th century in working class struggle. This is the place where the first warrant sale for anti-poll tax payment was due to take place. Right, background. It replaced domestic rates, which were introduced in Scotland in 1989, a year earlier than in England. Thatcher yet again. Yeah, we were the guinea pigs. Break the Scots, and then we'll break everybody else bit by bit. Taxpayer pays the same amount regardless of wealth or ability to pay. February 1990, more than 145,000 people had not paid a penny. Over 1 million non-payers in Scotland, 700,000 people facing legal action. STUC and Scottish Labour did nothing, right? And I know, because I was heavily involved, as a number of people were here. I was in the Strickland region headquarters when it was ratified. I remember the Labour Party at the time saying, pay it, because you can't break the law, pay it under duress. That was the Labour Party's position on it. Up here in Scotland, it was quite a loose coalition of people that were involved in the Scottish Anti-Poll Tax Federation. The most obvious one being Tommy Sheridan and Scottish Militant, right? But Tommy and Scottish Militant weren't the full picture by any manner of means. There was a lot of ordinary working class people who were politicised by the poll tax. They didn't have any allegiance to any political groups or anything, but they were just incensed. No, I'm not having this, I'm not putting up with it. And one of the things I always said, the beauty of the poll tax was, all you needed to do to fight it was just not pay it. That was the first step in fighting it. And I was involved, as were a number of people, out at 6 in the morning, heading off to places all over central Scotland in a motor, half asleep, going, what am I doing? It's freezing cold out here. And turning up usually in somewhere like Coat Bridge or something, and, at 7 o'clock in a winter's morning, and somebody had set up a brazier and you were hanging about and you were told, sheriff's officers are coming to pin somebody's furniture and take it away. Now, the way the law stood was they could take any non-essential items to recover debt. Now, any non-essential items would be stuff like televisions, computers, stuff like that. Although a lot of people didn't have computers back then, it was the early 90s. But say, for example, you had an £800 telly, they would value that telly at 40 quid to recover the debt. The sheriff's officers a lot of them were ex-police, right? Not all of them, but there's all these stories going about at the time about how these sheriff's officers, just doing their legal duty, were going out and being intimidated by the bad anti-poll tax federation. No the case. No the case. Yes, the anti-poll tax federation did stop them by physically being in front of people's front doors and saying, you're not getting by. And they were hearkening, echoing back to the rent strikes of 1915, when a lot of Scottish landlords, particularly in Glasgow, tried to increase the rents of households in Glasgow because they knew that the men were away on the Western Front fighting. So anyway, things came to a head. The sheriff's officers turned up on this woman's doorstep one day, chap to door. She didn't do what was the recommended course action, was say, you're no getting in, phoning the anti-poll tax federation shop, which was just up the road, and then getting out the house. Now, I was visited at the time by 2 sheriff's officers, and I'm not going to lie about it. 2 sheriff's officers turn up on your door, say they're legally here to pin your stuff. It's frightening. It's frightening. I'm not going to make out I was gallous about it or anything. I remember trying to phone the Anti-Poll Tax Federation hotline and my fingers slipping off the dial in panic. I'm not going to lie about that. So a lot of people were in that situation, and as I say, they turned up on this woman's doorstep one day. They did have a habit of sort of hitting in the early afternoon at a time where most likely most members of the family would be out. And as I say, they managed to actually take furniture belonging to the women, and it was make or break. If they managed to sell this woman's furniture that day, as far as I was concerned, that was probably the anti-poll tax federation over. They defeated us. So it was important that that day should not go ahead with a successful sale. Tommy Sheridan, I know a lot of people are very critical of Tommy Sheridan in a lot of respects, but Tommy Sheridan was issued by the courts an interim interdict that day, forbidding him from appearing here. Tommy Sheridan turned up that day. Not only did he turn up, he ripped up that interim interdict on camera and said he didn't recognise it. So Tommy turned up knowing he was going to jail, and I think that showed a real courage, his conviction, to be honest with you, that day. So on that day, I remember coming up and setting out with a number of other anti-poll tax federation people, thinking, what are we facing when we get into the town? What are we going to be up against here? They're really going to want to make this go ahead. I really hope we've got a brilliant turnout for this. There was about 150 people, which for a make or break thing that affected so many people, I thought was a really, 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 really poor turnout. I'm not going to romanticise it. And I was quite honestly dismayed. And I remember we didn't come directly here because we didn't want maybe the police coming along, trying to move us on, gauge our numbers, stuff like that. And I remember we had an ad hoc meeting round, I don't know if you remember the old General Bayer, round just on the road up to the barras. They had a wee bit, you could enter by the side of the building and had a wee pin, and there was like 100 years there at like back at 8 in the morning having a wee meeting about how we were going to do this. And we come down here to find the gates locked like they are today. And I remember we could see in, and there was a van in there, and the 2 sheriff's officers were sitting in the van, and just the sheer weight of people burst the lock of the door and everybody stormed in, and there was a load of that, you know, the temporary fencing that they put up in gigs to just sort of keep you going in certain directions. Well, the story goes that when some people got in, I was quite far behind, and my mother was with me that day. And my mother was caught. My mother's a wonderful woman, but she's quite timorous. And she was raging, she was angry, and she got in there, and she says, I got in there and thought, what do I do now? What am I meant to do? So, oh, good God, there's a policeman there, and there's a policeman there, and a policeman there. There was police everywhere. There was police patrolling the area. Place had a lot of policemen in there. And the story goes that a lot of people grabbed the fencing, and there was a load of tussle with the police over the fencing. And somebody at one end of this whispered to the next person, pass it along on the count of 3, let go. And there was this hustling and tussling, and all you heard was 1, 2, 3, and they're like, none of these police fell on their back, and people charged the van. And they wanted the stuff out the van there and then. And I remember the sheriff's officer driving the van actually started up the van and slowly started moving it forward. And the crowd actually physically got the van. And although the van was in first and moving forward, they physically pushed it back. And at that point, I believe the police advised the sheriff's officers to call it off. So they did actually call it off. And what I'm going to do, this is a copy of Tommy Sheridan's book. I'm going to pass it round, and I've earmarked 2 photographs. Well, sorry, I've earmarked 1 photograph on it with 2 wee post-its. The 2 post-its, the younger looking guy in the foreground is my dad, and there's an older guy at the back in a shirt and tie, who I'm not going to say anything about him at the moment, but he's a very, very important character in this story, so I'll just pass that round. That's my dad's personal copy, so I'll need that back. But yeah, a few weeks later, if I remember correctly, there was a second attempted warrant sale, and that was out at Bonnyrigg in the back end of Edinburgh. And I remember we set off at something like 5:30 in the morning. I couldn't drive, but my mother had a car. My mother was working, so we had to get somebody to get a taxi up at like 5 o'clock in the morning, drive the car, collect me, collect my dad, collect other couple of people, and we drove through to Bonnyrigg. Remember that time, no sat-nav or anything like that, so you're sitting in the passenger seat with a map going, where the hell am I going? And eventually we got to Bonnyrigg, and we pulled up. It was about 9 in the morning we arrived. And at that time, the sheriff's officers could come any time between 8 in the morning and 8 at night. We got there, and the person had a driveway and parked up, and we got out the car. Nice turnout again. Somebody'd get a brazier. The woman whose house was meant to be being pindied, she had just endless cups of tea. And that was quite a common thing. When you turned up at an area that was being pindied, working class people would come out for houses everywhere. Hold on, son, I'm just bringing out some sandwiches. Hold on, I'm just going to get you a wee cup of tea. Hold on, somebody's phoned me. They've just told me that there's sheriff's officers round the corner trying to get into somebody else's house. And I remember this day in Bonnyrigg, about 10 o'clock in the morning, they hadn't appeared, and their next door neighbour came out, and just I happened to be the nearest person, and he said to me, what's happening? And it says, well, you see your neighbour there, the sheriff's officers have come to do a pendant for non-payment of poll tax. Like that, right? Okay, right, I see. Yeah, fair enough, aye, okay. Can you move your caravan to go shopping? Not everybody was behind the fight against the poll tax. A lot of people were involved. A lot of people done nothing. A lot of people that were affected done nothing. And there was some people that just thought the Anti-Poll Tax Federation were just troublemakers out to cause trouble. And that's certainly not what I felt. I was morally outraged by the poll tax. I don't go looking for trouble. I think what we done was not only the only thing we could do, but the honourable thing to do. So, very, very, very important location in late 20th century working class history. What we're going to do now is we're going to just move up the road, and the black fence up there is no longer there. That was the Anti-Poll Tax Federation shop. Again, pre-mobile times, So it was what we call was phone trees. They would phone somebody when they heard the activity. They would phone somebody else, and you were expected to phone other people and just do a reactive thing. And it was not uncommon to get a phone call. There's a sheriff's officer in the next street to you, and it'd be, right, oh shit, phone up, dial the 4 nearest people to you, and then head round. And it was enough to stop it. There wasn't I'm not saying I'm unaware of violence at any point, but it seemed to be just a sheer presence was enough to stop them. A lot of the time you would hear the police had advised them not to go any further. So they were acting a lot of the time on the police's advice. The police weren't coming to us and saying, we advise you to go away before we charge you. They were advising the sheriff's officers it was not in their best interest. And it's really, really weird. I've got to the age now where there's people turning up in their 20s on your doorstep saying, I'm doing a dissertation on the anti-poll tax movement. Could I interview you? And I'm going, you know, right, well, you'll remember, and, you know, like back in what it was like in 1991, and they're going saying, no, I wasn't born until like 1999, and you're going, oh, good God, I feel old, you know, I feel very old, you know. But anyway, we'll move up to the location of the old shop, and then we're moving round. So this is the next location. This 151 Gallagate was the home of the guy in the middle in the shirt and tie, the old guy in the shirt and tie in the middle, Robert Bobby Lynn. Robert Bobby Lynn was an absolute legend in Glaswegian anarchist circles. He was born in 1924. He trained as an apprentice engineer on the Clyde during the Second World War. There was a series of apprentice strikes in 1943 that swept through the country, reached the Clyde. Bobby was involved in the Clydeside strikes. He was eventually blacklisted by the employers in collusion with the communist trade unions that were involved in the Clyde as well. In the early 50s, he became an active member of the then Glasgow Anarchist group, and he was a believer in a philosophy called conscious egoism, which is a bit of a mouthful, but to quote, all actions of men are either taken in the quest of happiness or the avoidance of pain. So that's where his political philosophy stemmed from. He was held in very, very, very high regard in the Calton. At times he'd been involved in some criminal activity and spent some time up in the Barrel. And it was during this time that a very, very, very young Matt McGinn met him. And it was actually Bobby, during one prison stint, that politicised Matt McGinn. Although Matt McGinn himself didn't go on to become an anarchist. In the early 60s, I mean, the Calton's now becoming very, very gentrified. Barras are changing radically. But in 1964, another famous Glasgow anarchist, guy born in Partick, guy called Stuart Christie, went to Spain as an 18-year-old, and his intention was to kill General Franco, the Spanish leader. Now, Franco had came to power after a coup in 1936, which resulted in a 3-year civil war, and Franco was incredibly oppressive towards the Spanish people. Thousands of people killed, thousands of people jailed. So, as I say, the very young idealistic Stuart Christie went with intention to kill him. Turns out they knew about the plot all along, and he was arrested basically as soon as he hit Spanish soil. He was meant to be garroted when he was found guilty, which is a particularly unique form of execution, where you're tied to a special chair with your hands and your feet tied behind you, and then a rope is placed around your neck with usually a little wooden bar, which is then twisted until it constricts your throat and kills you. But basically after 3 years, there was a lot of petitioning for Britain, and Christie was released And at one point he was coming up here to see Bobby Lynn in the mid-60s, and he got here late at night, and a couple of dubious characters cornered him down at Glasgow Cross. "Who are you, son? Where are you fae?" And he just thought, "Oh, good God, I'm getting weighed in here. These guys are seriously shady." And then they said to him, "And what business you got here?" He says, "I'm going to see my pal." And he said, "Who's your pal?" And he went, "Bobby Lynn." And he went, "All right, son, moan this way." They took him to Bobby's door. Chapped the door and went, "Bobby, this boy's here to see you. Oh no, by the way, son, be careful in here. There's a lot of dodgy characters." So that's the esteem that Bobby was held in. He ended up becoming, for many, many years, the secretary of the Glasgow Anarchist group. And at one point, he'd used a semi-derelict building in the Barras in the early 1960s as a shebeen. Now, if you don't know what a shebeen is, it's an illegal drinking den where you can basically just offer booze for a fraction of what it would be in a pub. And I remember saying to him, "Did you ever get grief off the police, Bobby?" And he was quite a funny, very eccentric guy. A few of you knew him. And he had very, very strange mannerisms. And I remember him saying, and you remember it, he went, "Ahem. Yes, I do remember on a couple of occasions the police busted my shebeen." And I says to him, "Did you get grief, Bobby?" And he said they were more interested in the anarchist literature I was giving the customers than the fact that I was running a shebeen. So quite a guy, and very, 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 very fondly remembered within anarchist circles and in the Calton generally. To this day, people remember him with a lot of fondness. The arch just down there, him and his common law wife, Jean, who was a hawker at the Brigget, used to sell all sorts of tat underneath that bridge down there. The cheapest Easter eggs at Easter, these absolutely really vile cheap Easter eggs. Plastic flags, anything, you name it. And that's how they made their living. And he eventually died in 1994, but quite an interesting character. We're just going to go along to the cross here and just up to the right to the next stop, okay? I'll just lead the way so we know exactly where we're going. In Glasgow, this place was called the Strickland Press, and I've got a photograph of it here. Sorry. Right. This was established as an anarchist printing house in 1939 by a small group of anarchists, most well known of which was a guy called Guy Aldred. And Guy Aldred was born in London, and he actually started life as a voice teacher, believe it or not, Christian voice teacher. Eventually found atheism, went through a number of different manifestations of left politics, eventually became an anarchist. He was involved with a number of different groups, the United Socialist Movement in Glasgow, and the anti-parliamentary Communist Federation.
The anti-panties.
Right, okay. He worked extensively with three other anarchists, a woman called Jenny Patrick, who became the second John partner, a woman from Bell's Hill called Ethel MacDonald. Ethel MacDonald is really quite famous. She actually went to Spain at the start of the Spanish Civil War in the late 1936, and she reported back to Britain from Barcelona on an English-speaking radio station, and was well known in Scotland through our radio broadcasts. Eventually, when the communists, backed by Stalin, managed to take more control of the revolutionary situation, she actually got arrested a couple of times and then was advised that it would be a good idea for her to leave Spain, because by this time the communists were actually starting to round up all the other lefties in Spain and either putting them in jail or killing them. And there was a guy called Bob Smiley, and Bob Smiley was an associate of George Orwell, cheers, and Bob Smiley was arrested by the communists. He was a member of the Independent Labour Party. He'd been over to Spain with international brigades. He got arrested for having on him 2 deactivated grenades that he was intending to take back as souvenirs. And while he was in custody under the communists, he was quite naive, and whatever he said to him, they hit him with more charges. And then he developed peritonitis and died in hospital. Although a number of people, including a doctor, said they saw his body and he'd been clearly kicked to death in custody. So there's that. As I say, the communists eventually got a load of funding from Stalin. Not unlike the situation we've got in the Ukraine at the moment. We've got various countries, I think it's Iran, it's backing Putin at the moment. The Iranians are giving Putin military hardware, and on the Ukrainian side, various Western countries are selling. So in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, you had the situation where the communists were being backed by Russia and Franco was getting assistance for Hitler. And in fact, the Luftwaffe bombed the town at Guernica on Franco's behalf, just to sort of show off the damage they could do with their new Stukas. Out of every country in the world, per head of population, more Scots went to fight in Spain than anywhere else. So really, really quite amazing contribution the Scots made in Spain. It was something like 600 Scots went to fight in Spain. Even having at one point a bus parked in George Square that the corporation supplied, and they said they put a message round all the Glasgow corporation garages and said, we will hold a job open for a year to any corporation bus driver that's willing to drive this bus to Spain. And what they invited Glaswegians to do was come and make donations of any sort, and they were put on the bus, and the bus was driven to Spain to back the Spanish Republicans who were fighting against Franco. Basically, for just very, very, very brief background, Spain was moving more and more in a liberal direction through a series of elections. And in 1936, the most liberal government yet had been elected. And one of the right-wing generals, General Franco, who was a nobody up until then, led a military coup on behalf of the king, and it went into a 3-year battle. And a lot of socialists and working class people from all over went to fight in Spain. Like we've seen in recent years in other countries, people have went to support what's going on in Palestine and demonstrate against the Israeli occupation in Palestine. You got the same thing in Spain. People went to fight on the side of the Spanish. The British government made it illegal to go to Spain to fight. So what a lot of people done was they made their way by hook or by crook down to Dover, got a day ticket over to France, made their way to the Pyrenees by hook or by crook, and people would come over from the Spanish side and take them over by night and train them to go and fight with the international brigades. So Strickland Press was here, and the Strickland Press comprised 4 main people, were Guy Aldred, Jenny Patrick, Ethel MacDonald and John Taylor Caldwell. Now, despite his double-barrelled name, John Taylor Caldwell came from a very, very, very poor working class background. And about 25 years ago, I was attending an event that was organised by a load of older anarchists in Glasgow. And somebody says, we should get Caldy out to the event. And somebody said to me, because I was driving, would you mind going and getting John Taylor Caldwell out the care home? And that's what I done. He was in a care home in Lamb Hill. So I went up to get him. This is him here, up in the top corner. I'll pass that round. And this lovely, genteel, wee, mild-mannered man came out, and we exchanged pleasantries going down the road. And I thought, yeah, Really, really, really nice wee old guy, but obviously well past his best. So they got him down there, they put a few whiskies in them, and they said, Caldy, give us a speech. And Caldy got up and gave a wee speech on anarchism and why you should be an anarchist. And quite frankly, I was absolutely gobsmacked. And about 10 years later, I was watching, the BBC had made a programme, a documentary about Ethel McDonald's trip to Spain. And they'd done wee reconstructions of what was obviously the Strickland Press offices. And I'm standing watching it and I'm going, right, that's Guy Aldred, that's Ethel McDonald, that's John Taylor Caldwell, that is obviously John Taylor Caldwell. And I said to my mum and dad, hold on a minute, that's Gary next door. And sure enough, the young boy that was playing John Taylor Caldwell was the son of our next door neighbour, who's an actor. And again, cutting back to this 1937 May Day photograph, this is John Taylor Caldwell at the extreme here as a young man. Absolutely phenomenal guy. And he actually closed Strickland Press in May 1968. As the uprising in Paris was kicking off, John Taylor Caldwell was closing up Strickland Press for the last time. Throughout the Second World War and into the early 60s, the anarchist newspaper, The Word, was produced here, and The Word was in constant trouble throughout the Second World War because a hell of a lot of the stuff, and it was about conscientious objection and no being involved in what was regarded as a capitalist fight with a set of nations against another set of capitalist nations, where working class people were sent to kill other working class people. Quite a phenomenal place. And there is a few collections now. We can actually go and look and see back issues of The Word, and there's even recordings on tape of Guy Aldred giving some of his speeches, but I'm told they're actually quite boring and arcane by modern standards. So we've got three more places. Sorry, of course.
Part of the reason why Ethel McDonald went to Barcelona was because not only were they fighting fascism, but it was also an anarchist social revolution taking place. But Spain at the time was sort of the last remaining stronghold of the anarchist labour movement. The CNT, the National Confederation of Labour, had a million members. The Anarchist Federation had 30,000 members. It was well embedded in the labour movement. And when Franco tried to overthrow the Republican government, it was the CNT who took the lead in most of the country, and they seized weapons and stormed the barracks and defeated the army in 2/3 of Spain. And went for the CNT, basically, that would happen in Germany, where the fascists took power without any resistance at all, in spite of the German Communist Party, in spite of the German trade union, in spite of the German Socialist Party having had millions of members. It happened in Spain. So, but after they defeated the fascist coup, they didn't go back to the workplaces as they were. They took them over, started working the workplaces themselves. They took on local control. The peasants seized the land. There was a social revolution. If you read George Orwell's 1984, sorry, wrong one.
Hobbies Catalonia.
He gives a vivid account of what it was like in December 1936. And so the reason why the anarchists went over was one, to join the CNT militia to fight the fascists, but also to support the revolution. So Emma Goldman came here as part of fundraising for international anti-fascist solidarity and to argue the case for the CNT5 and the anarchist message. So that's part of what was going on. People were going to Spain to support the revolution more than the fight fascists. Were you mentioning Mary Louise Benera?
No, I didn't, no.
Okay, so another person that came up here was Mary Louise Benera during the 40s. She was a daughter of Camillo Benera, a very famous Italian anarchist, and he was assassinated by the Stalinists in Barcelona in 1937 during the May Days. And she got involved in the British anarchist movement, and she came up regularly here to Glasgow, spoke to meetings in Glasgow. It was a very big anarchist group, very active anarchist group at the time. Bobby Lynn was part of it, other people like Frank Leach and so forth. So she came up And one of her letters back to her partner, Berlin Richards in London, she went up to Loch Lomond and said, "This is gorgeous. I was like, if I could stay here, I would stay here." So like Bolton declared previously. So she came up and she spoke regularly as well. But the important thing is, like, the reason why Spain, why we said Red Barcelona on the Guy Aldwood banner, is because there was an anarchist revolution. The CNT working militias were fighting the fascists, and that's why people went over to fight. And George Orwell, when he arrived, he hadn't realised what was going on, because it was a democracy versus fascism story. And he came and saw what was happening on the ground. He thought, "Oh, I can't report, I can't have to fight." So he joined the Pune militia and he reported on what was going on. But the important thing to remember is, like, it wasn't just a fight against fascism and democracy. It was also a fight between social revolutions, like libertarian socialism, anarchism, and fascism as well. And in terms of international solidarity, as well as, like, anarchist fundraising, sending people over, Communist Party sending people over international brigades. But the only country which supplied the Republic with arms was Mexico. They gave the arms to the Republic for nothing. Stalin's Russia gave them arms, but they got a lot of gold back in return. So much for solidarity. It was all very much the case of the interest of the Stalinist ruling class was put first in terms of international working class solidarity. So that's an important part of the overall context.
Yeah. Aye. The Battle of George Square 1919, that's the thing that Glasgow George Square is most famous for. Confrontation between police and striking workers. Black Friday, 31st of the 1st. The STUC and the Clyde Workers Committee wanted to increase available jobs for demobilised soldiers. And how they suggested this was done was the working week should be cut from 47 hours to 40 hours. Now, there's a couple of things here that strike me as being a bit I'm wondering where they were coming from, because these guys had went to war, risked their lives, and they'd come back and they were looking for work. I think if I'd been in the First World War, I wouldn't be coming back looking for work. I'd want to own the means of production. I'd want to be part of a different society, especially if I'd risked my neck. So they talk about Red Clydeside and this being the zenith of Red Clydeside, what happened that day. I see it as anything but. And ultimately it was a failure. Yes, the working week did eventually get shortened, but that's not really advantageous to the working class as a whole, having slightly less working hours. So, yeah.
I remember my gran vaguely remembers something about my granddad was here when that happened, that 1919.
That's it, 1919, yeah.
Tanks in and everything. I remember.
Yep.
She didn't speak much about it, but I kind of remember little bits.
Aye, aye.
Awful.
Well, they brought.
Post office, apparently,
Yeah.
guns
Yep.
in the windows.
Yep, that's right. And the tanks, I believe, were held up at the meat market. And what they done was they locked Maryhill Barracks and they brought up English troops because they immediately thought Scottish troops aren't going to fire on fellow Scots. And there was another point I was going to make about it. They were the authorities were very, very, very jittery on the whole thing. Now, just think less than 2 years earlier, there'd been the revolution in Russia. Germany was in a state of flux at that particular time, immediate post-war. So there was the real serious threat that there was going to be revolution. Now, a number of the ringleaders were arrested and charged, them being David Kirkwood, Manny Shinwell and William Gallagher, and they were charged with instigating and inciting large crowds of persons to form a riotous mob, right? Okay. Gallagher and Shinwell were sentenced to 3 and 5 months, right? They both went on to become Labour MPs. And then after a period of time, one became Baron Kirkwood and the other one became Baron Shinwell. They became part of the establishment that in 1919 they'd stood face to face with to fight. That makes Red Clydeside in my books. That's the bow on the defeat of Red Clydeside in my books. I'm not saying, I think it'd be very naive to me to say it was a golden opportunity for the people of Scotland to turn this into a socialist country. I think that might have been way too much to ask, but at the same time, they settled for so very little, and they ended up becoming part of the game that they set out to oppose. Now, sorry.
It's interesting, like, when you were down in Glasgow Green, you mentioned that the 1919, 1920 May Day, like absolutely massive, like tens of thousands of people. And basically, as soon as they sent all the MPs over to Parliament, after sort of that period, sort of Red Clydeside sent all the Labour MPs to Parliament and basically expected these people to fight for them. The May Day in 1924 was like a couple hundred people. They started to look at their MPs to do things for them, and that sort of sense of direct action and solidarity on the ground had been dissipated in the ballot box. And in terms of the wasted opportunity, that helped reduce the wasted opportunity, because instead of building in their workplaces and their communities, people started thinking, oh, we'll get somebody into power to do it for us, and they left it to them to do it, and a golden opportunity was lost.
Aye. Very much so, very much so. So I'm going to just talk about the last two places. Are you familiar with the statue of La Passianara down in the Clydeside, the women standing on the Clydeside like that? Better to die on your knees, die on your feet than live on your knees. Nearly got it right. Right, anyway. Right, La Passianara, Dolores Ibarruri, if I've got that correct. Right, approximately 500 Scots served in Spain, 134 died, 65 of them were from Glasgow. They comprised 23% of the people from the UK that went to fight the international brigades. Essentially, the Spanish Civil War was a dry run for the Second World War. It was a fight against fascism, right? Amongst the first group to go was a Scottish ambulance unit led by a woman called Fernanda Jacobson, who eventually sent 3 ambulance convoys, but she's quite controversial because when she went over, she tended to wounded people on both sides, which didn't go down well with people fighting for the Republican cause. A food ship with 100 tonnes of food was sent by Glasgow and Edinburgh Trades Council. It's quite remarkable. And again, drawing parallels. We can draw parallels with the aid that's been sent to the West, to the Ukraine and Palestine as well. Not all the people involved in what was happening in Spain were positive. There was a Captain Archibald Moll Ramsay, who was a Scottish Unionist MP for Peebles. He formed an organisation called the United Christian Front and claimed that Franco was fighting the Antichrist in Spain. Quite a statement. Scots POWs in Spain were eventually repatriated at a cost of £3, 19 shillings and 3p. Now, there's a rich irony there. A lot of these people were repatriated in 1939. They'd went with a clear understanding they were going to fight fascism. When they were repatriated, their repatriation was paid by the British government, but the British government was soon knocking on their door. You owe us £3, 19 shillings and 3p. So cough up. And then the Second World War broke out, and a lot of these guys thought, oh no, we're fighting fascism again, and went to go and sign up. But because they'd been in Spain, and the British government, like a lot of governments in Europe, didn't want them to go and fight in Spain, because there was a lot of, and this is played right down in Britain, in France, apart from the fascist dictatorships in Italy and Germany at the time, there was a lot of sympathy for fascism. This is something that's played right down, particularly amongst the British establishment. There is the infamous photograph of the British royal family giving the Sieg Heil salute. So there was a lot of sympathy for fascism in this country. In fact, even when Britain eventually went to war, there was a lot of people who, high-ranking people, who were sympathetic and wanted to appease Hitler. So, and also as well, the role of the Catholic Church in Spain was very oppressive. A lot of people could relate to that over here, and that's why they went to fight. But,
Also say
sorry.
Was Churchill. He recognised quite soon, to his credit, that German Nazism was going to impede on the British Empire, and that's why he was an early opponent of Nazism. Not because he objected to what Hitler was doing internally. He was fine with that. He was fine with Mussolini destroying the communists and the unions and all that. That was good, and he said as much. But he recognised that the German Nazi war machine was going to crash with the British Empire, and he was right about that. And ultimately, that was the roots of his anti-Nazism. It wasn't against Hitler, it wasn't against Mussolini. He said good things about both of them. He just recognised it was going to be a potential enemy of British Empire. And in fact, he was quite right, and he was quite dissident, unlike some of Peter's comrades in the British middle class who bind themselves to the threat Germany posed to the British Empire.
Yeah. And you might be able to correct me here, at the tail end of the Second World War, the Greek royal family were pro-fascist, and essentially the anti-fascist movement in Greece was communist controlled. And at the end of the Second World War, I think it was the British Army were sent in to basically kill the anti-fascist movement. They were in and slaughtered them to maintain the status quo in Greece. And
similarly in Italy,
yeah,
there was uprisings towards the end of the war in Italy, and like workers' councils and stuff were thrown up. And when the British and the Americans liberated Italy, they basically put a lot of the former fascists back into the position.
Yeah.
And clamped down on the Labour Party.
Yeah, as they did in Germany as well. A lot of the German bureaucracy, particularly in banking, had been fascist. And of course, the cream of the Nazi rocket programme ended up in the States. I've also seen a first edition British copy, or English copy I should say, of Hitler's Mein Kampf. And when you open it, there's a review from an observer, the reviewer in the Observer, and he says that Mr. Hitler's written an exceedingly interesting book. And I mean, I have actually read Mein Kampf, and apart from the fact it's a pile of crap, there is an overtly anti-Semitic statement in it. So there is no way that could be misconstrued in any other way. So La Passianara, the statue down on the Clyde, I just wanted to say a wee bit about her. It's a magnificent statue, and what a brilliant slogan. Better to die on your feet than live forever on your knees. She said this in French radio in 1936. The statue, when it was erected in 1980, caused a bit of row in here between the Labour and the Tory group, right? The Conservatives accused Labour of clandestine manoeuvres and brilliantly erecting a horrid monument to a horrid hag, right? During the unveiling, the Conservatives held a counter-demonstration and wanted her replaced by a statue of Churchill. You know, make it up what you will, right? She was a charismatic and rallying speaker, absolutely no doubt about that. She was also an ardent Stalinist. She thought he was absolutely wonderful. And in the mid-30s, a couple of people were starting to realise, a few people on the left were starting to hear things that weren't very nice about Stalin. And they were saying, hold on a wee minute here, there was stuff like there was a famine in the Ukraine in the mid-30s, and it turned out food was being exported for the Ukraine to the various cities, and this was all covered up, completely covered up by the Stalinist regime. All sorts of horrible things, a series of trials. The Russian composer Shostakovich, who was Stalin's favourite composer, basically lived a hellish life under Stalin because he had to please Stalin. And one day, after writing a new symphony, he was visited by the secret police, and he was taken in and he was interviewed. And at the end of the interview, they went, right, okay, Mr. Shostakovich, we want you to come back in on Monday morning for further interviewing. And Shostakovich thought, this is it, my number's up. And he went home that weekend and he packed a bag and he said to his wife, look, we've got to make the best of this weekend. I think I'm not coming back on Monday evening. And he went in on Monday morning and he says, I have to report to Captain such and such. And somebody said, oh, he's been removed from his position. What he'd actually done was he'd been arrested and put in jail on a trumped up charge. and this was extremely common. But anyway, during what was called the May Days, when the Russians started putting funding into the communists, and the communists suddenly had more firepower, the battle went kind of three-way. There was the communists at one angle, the Franco and his supporters, the nationalists in the other, and then you had the anarchist, Trotskyists, and various other small left-wing groups, and it had become a three-way battle, particularly in places like Barcelona. It turns out that a guy called Alexander Orlov for the Russian secret police had been sent over to agitate, and as I say, this degenerated into this three-way battle. And this is when La Pasionara starts talking about the enemy within, as Thatcher did many years later. She goes on to say, and this is a direct quote, "Therefore it is essential that we wipe out Trotskyism with a firm hand." And then she says, anarcho-Trotskyists, which is a contradiction in itself, were attempting to shut down the Republican government on the orders of Franco. And then later she justified her actions by saying, "When the life of a people is in danger, it's better to convict 100 innocent ones than to acquit one single guilty one." Now they formed death squads, and they went up, rounding up anarchists, Trotskyists, and any other non-Stalinist leaning peoples. And it's at that stage Ethel MacDonald was told, "Get out of Spain now." George Orwell was told, "Get out of Spain now." And as I said, Bob Smiley, the guy from Lanark, is one of the people that didn't make it.